You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
This episode of Social Europe podcast is brought to you by the Said Business School, University of Oxford. The Oxford Executive MBA enables current and future business leaders to make a difference in their chosen field. The part-time program is designed to fit alongside your work commitments and offers you a global network. Visit the Said Business School, University of Oxford website for further details. Hello everybody and welcome to Social Europe podcast episode 43. My name is Henning, Meyer, Editor-in-Chief of Social Europe. Today I'm in conversation with David Autor, a professor of economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or short MIT, and we talk about the present, the future, and the past of work and how robotics, AI, and other technological developments are likely to impact the work of the future. As always, I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, David Autor, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to me today about jobs, automation, the past of jobs, the present of jobs, and where we are going. And just as a warm up for people who might not be up to speed with the recent discussions, fear of automation has been a historic feature of technological advancement. And has it ever been warranted, or what would you see as the history of automation and its impact on labor markets?
Well, it certainly has a long history, and I would say it's always been warranted in a way, but usually not the way people think. Usually the concern is expressed in terms of the elimination of all work and the idea that there will be no more employment, and this has cropped up at various points in history. Many people refer to the Luddite rebellion of British weavers. But you don't have to look that far back. This was a concern in the United States before even the Great Depression. The U.S. Secretary of Labor, James Davis, was concerned about the so-called scrapping of men, where he was referring to scrapping like what you would do with machines. Or even after the Second World War, President Johnson started the Commission on Productivity and Employment, Blue Ribbon Commission. And the fear there was actually that productivity was growing so fast that there would be insufficient labor demand. And so it was a concern about a shortfall of demand. So I think there's been many points in history. I think what they have been wrong about so far is the idea that we would run out of work, that people would be rendered useless. And nothing close to that has occurred. However, there's another concern that I think is much better grounded, which is that it will be very disruptive for some and create, a concentrated set of people who are made worse off by automation because their skills and livelihoods have been devalued. And that's happened many times. And that did happen during the Industrial Revolution. That did happen with the skilled weavers, that in some sense they were made redundant. There was a lot of productivity growth in weaving, in textiles, but it didn't redound to rising wages for 4 to 6 decades, and so it contributed to rising living standards among people who bought those materials and so on. But it didn't actually. It essentially replaced artisanal labor with a lot of sweatshop labor, a lot of children working in mills, in textile mills. So I think that's a completely legitimate concern, and so it's easy to sort of, say, oh, these people, don't they know? Haven't they read the history? Everyone always gets worried about it. It always turns out fine. But I don't think I think that's too simple. It doesn't turn out fine for everybody. And sometimes it turns out better than others because of, policies that we've enacted or investments that we've made to help people adapt. So, in the early 20th century, when the U.S. was moving very, very rapidly out of agriculture, U.S. states independently, many of them made the decision to require children to remain in school until the age of 16, what was called the so-called high school movement. And that was a very costly decision to make because, not only did you have to build buildings and hire teachers and buy books, but children couldn't work on the farm during that time. And it was considered, at the time, kind of a radical step because it wasn't obvious why everyone needed to be both literate and numerate and to have that relatively high level of education. It turned out to be a very wise investment. It allowed people, arguably gave the U.S. kind of one of the most flexible and productive and versatile workforces in the world. And that helped with the process of movement out of out of agriculture and into industry and into services. But that didn't happen on its own. So many people look at that period in history and say, oh, it all worked out great. Don't worry about it. But it didn't work out great by accident.
So it was politically steered, and we'll come back to that towards the end. I mean, would you then say that it is a fair characterization that the fear that we're running out of work is literally unwarranted, but there's always been transitional pains and transitions that had been harder for certain people and easier for others?
Well, I don't want to say the fear is unwarranted. The fear has never been proven out. There's never been a period where we have run out of work because of automation. However, there's no proof that couldn't possibly occur, but we haven't seen it happen, and there's no evidence that it's happening right now. Right, we are in a kind of a worldwide jobs boom in the industrialized world. Now, a lot of that has to do with demographics, but nevertheless, we're not running short on jobs. But it's certainly almost always warranted to be thinking, well, if the required skill sets are changing fast, if things that I've been doing are now done by machines, it's not obvious that that's a good outcome for me. And certainly, so we should expect to see disruption. And the disruption, in the last 4 or 5 decades, especially the last 3, has been most concentrated among the less educated. Mm-hmm. Who have high school or lower education in particular. And in the U.S., we've seen a real decline in earnings, especially among high school educated men.
Yeah, and interestingly, I mean, also the labor market sort of trade-off that John Maynard Keynes predicted did also not come about. So we didn't trade basically working hours for more leisure time. That prediction didn't seem to come true. Would you agree with that?
It's actually quite multifaceted. So among the less educated, we do see more leisure, less work, but also not very high wages. And arguably, people have insufficient work. They're not working as much as they want to. Among the highly educated, we see just the reverse. They have tons and tons of income and consumption, but they work extremely long hours. And the correlation between annual earnings and hours worked, hourly wages and hours worked per year has gotten far steeper and stronger in the United States over the last 35 years. Back in the 1970s, the highly paid individuals only worked a little bit more per year than did lower paid individuals. And you could easily imagine it would have been the reverse. Actually, the lower your pay, the more you had to work. At this point, people of very high earnings levels are often, they're overemployed. They don't just do one job. They do 1.5 or 2 jobs. They wish they could work only 60 hours a week, but they're working 80.
But because probably their skill set is so specialized that it's not easy to split these jobs into different parts. And even though the productivity is low at the lower end, there might not be just enough work to go around. Or is it a choice to go for lower hours?
Often there's kind of excess labor supply. And firms don't want to hire workers full time because they prefer to, have partial benefits and just kind of keep people on a contingent basis depending on what are demand conditions at the store or at the restaurant. At the high end, there's 2 things. I mean, one is that many of these jobs have so-called indivisibilities, meaning that you can't just take a big legal case and split it down the middle among 2 people. It kind of requires one mind to be fully wrapped around it. The other is that there's so much demand for highly skilled individuals, we're not producing them fast enough. And so if you can't improve them on the extensive margin, i.e. the number, you increase them on the intensive margin, i.e. the number of hours that they work. And so I think it's related to rising wages for the highly educated. That reflects scarcity. And that scarcity, causes people to have higher pay and higher, and a greater probability of being employed, but then conditional on being employed, they work more hours.
And, would you say that the tendency or the trend that you identified in your previous research, the sort of polarization, the dumbbell model of the labor market, is that continuing? I mean, your latest work seems to make a distinction between frontier jobs and wealth jobs. Whereas wealth jobs are basically low-skilled service sector, personal services related jobs, and frontier jobs are really the jobs you seem to just have described, where a very specialized skill set is needed and there are indivisibility issues at hand.
Yeah, so the work that you're describing is ongoing work with Anna Salomons of Utrecht University, and there we try to characterize some of the new work that's emerging. And that's not all work, it's just the new job titles that are being created. And this is building on an approach that's developed by Jeff Lynn, who's an economist at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank. And we looking at, and that's very preliminary, but certainly tantalizing and suggestive. We look at when you look at these new titles that are populated by the Census Bureau every decade, and how do these come about, by the way? Well, they come about because the Census Bureau asks people what they do, and then they try to classify them. But if enough people say something that they haven't heard before, they kind of create a new title for that thing. So, like a job that appeared in the U.S. Census in 2000 is the barista, or in 2010 is the sommelier. Now, this is not new work, right? Obviously, there have been baristas for as long as there's been Italy, and sommeliers for as long as there's been France, I have to presume. But enough people were doing them in the United States as a career that that now gets specifically and separately enumerated. So, looking at those lists of new titles, what you see is it's like about 40% of them roughly are maybe a little bit less are what we call frontier jobs. These are the ones that involve working with the new technology or translating the new technology. So you could be a robot integrator, you could be a radiological medicine specialist, you could be someone who is a search engine optimizer. So you're kind of working with the new stuff. But a larger fraction, over half by our measure, or what we call wealth work jobs. These are jobs that are not technologically progressive in any sense, but they often involve high-end luxuries and services for people, probably many of them who are doing the frontier work and making a good amount of money. So things like, a horse exerciser, an indoor gardener, an oyster preparer, sommelier, barista, and those tend to be clustered around the places where we see all this frontier work, where there's a lot of money. And, like yoga studios are a very, very rapidly growing area, industry in the United States from a small base, obviously, but it's probably haven't been a lot of technological breakthroughs in yoga in the last millennium or so. They're mostly, that's coming from consumption patterns of the affluent. Going back to your question about polarization, you could say those jobs are fairly polarized in the sense that, one is, highly educated, highly paid, and the other, many of these services, they're moderately educated. They're about average or below average pay. And an interesting distinction between them in our data is that these frontier jobs are disproportionately male, or done by men, and the wealth jobs are disproportionately done by women. Really, very heavily. So, 2/3 of the wealth work that we see appears to be done by women. 2/3 of the frontier work or more appears to be done by men. And the women in these wealth jobs are more educated than average, they tend to be. So you might imagine college educated women who are working in restaurants and yoga studios, in entertainment and recreation. So it's certainly a mixed picture, and it's not clear that those wealth work jobs have a really strong career trajectory, right? That that you build skills and expertise and become more specialized over time, things that kind of lead to wage growth over the course of a career. And I think this points to a very simple way to say this is, we have lots and lots of jobs right now. For highly educated workers, we have lots and lots of great careers. For less educated workers, we have lots and lots of employment opportunities, but very few good careers, and arguably less than we used to have. Because a couple decades back, many more non-college workers were doing either manufacturing production work or were doing office clerical admin work, both of which are things at which you become more specialized over time. You develop a specific skill set that's, valuable to your employer that depends on knowledge of a specific machine or knowledge of the group of people with whom you work and the work processes of that organization. And so you're not immediately replaceable with the next person who applies for your job. But if you're doing cleaning, security, food service, home health aid, driving a vehicle, entertainment, recreation, it's not obvious that you become a great deal more productive or specialized at those things over the course of a decade or 2 decades. And so in some sense, you're if that's not the case, you're more replaceable. And that will tend to reduce wage growth, reduce job security over the career path. And so that's I think a big challenge is the declining career paths for less educated adults.
So there are basically 2 pressure points in this segment, if I get you right. I mean, the first one is the threat of automation that we already talked before, but on the other hand, this is also you're quite easily replaceable with other human workers because there's no specialization, special skill set. You basically you feel the pressure from both ends.
That's right, and I think that's the kind of paradox of the growth of service work, of service occupations, which we see in many countries, especially among the less educated. They do less office work, they do less production, they do more personal services. That work at the moment is really pretty hard to automate because it requires dexterity, it requires flexibility, it requires common sense, it requires sightedness, it requires flexible interactions and communications with people. So you'd say, wow, it's really hard for machines to do. It ought to be really valuable. But it's not actually very scarce because most people can do it without much training or certification. So that work tends to be numerous and can grow pretty rapidly without a lot of wage growth, except in a very tight labor market when people have to be compensated to do that as opposed to whatever other thing they were doing. And so like in the US right now, we do see strong wage growth at the bottom of the distribution in those jobs, reflecting the very tight labor market. But throughout the decade of the 2000s, we saw a lot of growth in those jobs without any wage growth. Mm-hmm. That is the paradox. So the fact that something is hard to automate, hard to have machines do, doesn't mean it's going to pay a high wage. It depends what is the supply of people who can do it as well. And supply to those jobs is likely to be pretty elastic because there's a large potential skill set of people who can do it. And the question is, will they want to do it? And it depends what else they could be doing. Now, one positive underlying force that's kind of working in favor of improving working conditions in that type of work is that, cohorts are getting much smaller. Birth rates are falling throughout the industrialized world. So there'll be fewer young people are going to come in and do, manual, physically demanding service labor. And 2, education rates are rising. In the U.S., education rates are actually rising quite rapidly, college-going rates and college completion rates among younger cohorts, something we haven't seen in a long time, actually. And that means that there'll be fewer people who are going to be interested in doing that work. So again, that creates, that reduces labor supply to that set of activities, and that will cause wages to grow. I mean, it'll also cause products to be more expensive, and it'll cause, service to be worse to restaurants and so on. But it's good for labor. It also, by the way, is a driver of automation. Mm-hmm. And this is a point that, Doron Acemoglu and Pascal Restrepo have pointed out that, a lot of the, where do we see robots being used most intensively? They're in countries that actually have rapidly aging populations. So, Germany, Korea, Japan, the U.S. less so, but the U.S. actually is comparatively young among industrialized countries, and China, which has a huge, has a baby, the one-child dividend. The one-child dividend has turned into one-child deficit at this point. Right now, they are running out of young people much more rapidly than other countries because of the very small cohorts that the one-child policy created.
And so interestingly, so we have basically 4 different trends at play at the lower end of the labor market. So you've got the potential of automation and the oversupply or big supply of people who could actually do these jobs. And at the same time, you have 2 balancing factors, which is the increasing level of education on average, and at the same time, demographic changes will tend to reduce the supply in this segment of the labor market. And
you see this like very intensively in agriculture, right? There's all kinds of every day you read about new attempts at agricultural robotics, right? So in the UK, there's this thing called a RoboCrop, which is a robotic strawberry picker that, in theory is going to be in the field, literally. Well,
they might need it after Brexit.
That's right. That's exactly. Well, that's just it. they're responding to declining immigration and high wages. And, that's very, very labor intensive work. Now, it's a really hard problem. You can't just send robots in the field to do what people are doing. You have to re-engineer the farm to make it happen. You have to make the plants much more consistent. You may have to change the genetics or grow different plants such that they that there's not as much variety. And the machines may have to have data on every single plant and what it's been fed and how long, because they may not be able to visually inspect accurately about whether the fruit is ripe or not. They may have to infer that from all the data that is there. And another thing is they actually have a huge amount of trouble dealing with changing light conditions outdoors. One of the great there's a great quotation in this New Yorker article about robots and farming, and one of the scientists remarks, if you're worried about the robots that are coming for you, just leave your porch light on. The light really confuses them. So anyway, but yeah, so and we'll see more of that. I mean, we'll see more robotics in agriculture, and eventually we'll see more robotics in food service, in cleaning, certainly in security, and so on. But at the moment, those problems are hard. The machines are expensive. They don't do that well, and labor is still pretty cheap. So a lot of a good chunk of the pace of that type of automation, I think, is being driven by pressure from labor scarcity.
And you already
not so much the case in AI and so on.
Yeah, and you already mentioned the case of different countries. I mean, your research, as I understand it, applies mostly to the United States. So do you
That's
see?
Right. My work has been pretty focused on the US.
Okay. Do you see different trends in different countries? I mean, in Germany, for instance, it seems to be less the case that you have this kind of polarization on the labor market, which might have to do with how the political economy is set up. So what is your overview basically over how these trends play out elsewhere?
Sure. I mean, Germany. So it's different in every country. There are certain similarities, certain differences. We do see, occupational polarization in most of the EU, and this goes to work by Goose and Manning and Salomons. Germany is unusual in that it's maintained a very large manufacturing base. And so that has, kept more of the middle skill blue collar work than you find in other countries. Germany has had a big rise of inequality and fall in wages at the bottom and so on. So it's not been immune, but it's, many other things have worked well there. And of course, trade has also played an important role in this, right? Part of the reason that Germany has, had such large, continued to have such a large manufacturing presence has been a very big exporter, especially to China. And that has worked really well. And the U.S. has been much more on the importer side, and that has led to a more rapid erosion of manufacturing employment that you might see elsewhere. So there are certainly differences, and they don't all translate into the same degree of inequality. So the U.S. has where many countries are to some extent buffeted by these common forces, but they have very different institutional responses in terms of labor standards, education policy, tax policy. So the U.S. is at a fairly extreme position of having an extremely unequal level of education. So we have extraordinarily broad skill sets, very few labor protections, and not especially progressive taxation. So the gap between pre and post tax inequality in the U.S. is much smaller than in many other countries. It's not that tax policy doesn't do anything to reverse market forces, but not as much as you would see in Germany or in the Nordic states or in France. So there are real differences.
And one very interesting aspect in your most recent work that I found is that you also looked at the geography within countries, and I think there's a very obvious correlation with how politics is playing out at the moment, not just in the US but also in other Western countries. So I mean, this kind of old sort of center periphery model is being reinforced by these trends, isn't it?
Well, so my work on the geography of this is so far only on the United States, although I'm studying other countries now. But what I can say is what I found in the U.S. In my recent work really surprised me, which is I've been studying this kind of decline of middle skill occupations and the kind of growing rate of the tails for quite some time. And I had sort of always assumed that was kind of a uniform phenomenon. Wherever you looked, that's what was happening. If you looked in a suburb or in a rural area or in a metro area or a city, kind of be the same pattern, maybe even be more extreme outside of cities and inside of cities. And it turns out that kind of presumption was just actually not at all correct. What was the case in the United States, looking from the 1970s forward, certainly, was that as you went from kind of rural areas to suburbs to metro areas to cities, you saw big differences in the type of work that non-college workers did. So as you kind of move up the population density gradient, you'd also be moving up a kind of occupational gradient where non-college workers were less likely to be found in services and in manual labor, and much more likely to be found either in manufacturing or in office admin clerical work. And so the type of work that non-college people did in cities was really different. And they got paid a lot more for doing that, even adjusting for cost of living. And then from 1980 to present, but especially after 1990, you see kind of an unwinding of that gradient so that there's no longer any difference in the type of work that, at a high level, that non-college workers do in cities versus metro areas versus suburbs versus rural areas. They're all now found in services, in food service, cleaning, healthcare, home healthcare, security, entertainment, recreation, transportation, and so as that has occurred, as that kind of unwinding of this particular gradient in occupations for non-college workers, as that has unwound, the urban wage premium among non-college workers has really dramatically declined. So it used to be, if you look at the 1950s, 1970s, wages were just rising very steeply in population density, or much higher in cities than in metro areas, than in suburbs and in rural areas. Partly that reflects cost of living, but partly it also reflects higher productivity there. And then over the last 25 years, the wage premium seen among college-educated workers has gotten only steeper in urban areas. There's been greater what people call agglomeration. And then it's unwound for non-college workers, such that the urban wage premium, net of cost of living, it's not even clear it's positive any longer for the less educated. And that's really, a really surprising change that I didn't expect to see, but is very, very clear once I looked closely at the data. Now, it's important to stress that the fraction of people who are, quote, non-college has declined substantially over time. So this is a subset of people at this point. High school or lower workers comprise, maybe 4 out of 10 of every hour's worked. So they've gone from being a majority to a minority, although a substantial minority. So it's not to say that everything's getting worse, or that even for the modal or the median or the average person, job opportunities are declining, wages are declining. But a substantial minority are definitely experiencing that very strongly in diminished occupational horizons. And of course, it means that, within cities, you see a clustering of highly educated, high wage, relatively young, actually, compared to historically, folks. And they're doing great, and they're, really kind of benefiting from all of the new technology and the opportunities it presents. And then there's a stratum of workers within urban areas who are less educated, and they basically are there to, see to the care and comfort and transportation and, physical needs of the affluent and educated. And then once you get outside of those areas, there's just much, much less of this kind of frontier work, and populations are getting older, and life isn't changing as fast, except for the sense that you're not a part of this dynamism.
So it's interesting. I mean, when I was still living in London, there was exactly the same problem that, in the most expensive areas in London, they had trouble getting cleaners, people removing rubbish, low-skilled service sector jobs, people, fulfilling these functions actually because they had to live so far away for cost reasons mainly, that it was they were almost unable to get there on public transport. So, gentrification of the cities might be. Do you have any idea what the drivers are yet, or?
mean, there are a number of drivers, and I don't know for sure. If I were to speculate, I would say probably the primary driver, I think, is the sort of growing agglomeration of skilled activities in cities. That they seem to, in this quote era of death of distance, proximity seems to be becoming more, not less important for the highly skilled. Being at the right university, at the right teaching hospital in Silicon Valley around other engineers, or in New York around other financiers, or in Los Angeles around other movie makers, that seems to be becoming, more important, not less important. So that has kind of driven a lot of, highly paid people into dense areas, and they push up prices a lot. Alongside that, in general, especially in the United States, cities have gotten a lot safer. They're a lot better places to live. So, one reason that highly educated adults would tend to leave urban areas as they hit their kind of prime working years is they could move out to suburbs where schools were better, safety was, improved, and and also there wasn't all the great food in cities to keep them there, at least in the U.S. And so it's the kind of the push factors that push people out of cities among the highly paid, highly educated have kind of abated. And I think, along part and parcel of that, and this is not a coincidence, fertility has fallen and the age of fertility has risen. So that makes it easier for, prime age working adults to stay in cities because, they don't need as much space and they don't need the great schools. And so it's easier for them to stay there. So I think those things have really contributed to the pricing pressure. And then the fact that non-college workers, are now kind of shunted out of these middle skill activities means that part of the wage benefit or the wage escalator that they might have gotten on being in an urban area is declining. Now, eventually, look, if people in cities want to have, restaurants and they want to have clean houses and they want to have transportation and they want to have security, they're going to have to pay, higher wages for that work. It's just going to, we may be in kind of a disequilibrium period, right? Where people are, the people who do those jobs are saying they can't afford to live there. Eventually, the highly educated are going to have to, pay them enough that they can live there, or do without, or automate more.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? It turns out that telework does not replace personal networks and social interaction after all.
No, not for it appears to be a complement rather than a substitute at this point, right? So, if you work with someone remotely in another country, chances are you'll be going to visit them, within a year to do some in-person stuff. And I mean, and maybe that will change, right? Maybe the technology will improve so much that will no longer be necessary. But one thing is you're not going to meet people by happenstance, on your computer monitor, right? Like I have a great monitor on my wall. I interact with lots of co-authors on that monitor. But I never just happen to meet someone on my screen and say, "Hey, what are you thinking about? Let's
let's write a paper together." Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of. I think you'll see a lot more kind of mixed, where people commute into high density areas for a couple days a week, then they work from home other days, and right. And I think a lot of people do a kind of a mixture of the two, but I don't think yet is it feasible to pursue a super high end career out in the middle of a rural area just over the internet.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. I mean, before we come to the policy implications that I'm particularly interested in, I mean, the next, if you talk about the last 30 years was globalization, then digitization, and the next big thing seems to be quantum computing and applications that might come online or might not come online in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, do you see any specific features of quantum computing that could change this sort of equilibrium, or would it just be digitization on steroids?
Well, quantum computing will definitely change things. I'm not sure so much in this domain. The first thing it'll do is they'll break all cryptography instantly.
Okay.
So,
well, I ask you because you're at MIT. I mean, you're probably the best economist to ask about this.
The day quantum computing, becomes viable is the day every security mechanism we currently use for digital technology is instantly the locks are wide open. So that itself is a problem. But I think but setting aside quantum computing per se, what we know much, much less about are the sort of rate of progress and capabilities of, artificial intelligence as opposed to robotics. Robotics faces all kinds of, real engineering challenges, right? That, are very incremental in their solutions. But things that are just live on software and in computers and don't have to have a physical embodiment, can potentially improve much faster. And we don't know how fast they'll improve and what they'll be able to do. And when I say we, I don't really mean myself. I'm just an observer. But even the people in this field are, there's a vigorous debate and a wide range of opinions about how fast things will progress and are progressing. People in Silicon Valley sort of think, it'll all be done by, 2025, like everything, all problem solved. Many more academics are very, cognizant of the limitations, that the machines are really, really effective in certain types of environments. And what you might call a kind of learning environment, which is an environment where there's a well-defined set of rules, you get instant feedback. It's very conducive to learning because if you make the right choice, you get a reward. If you make the wrong choice, you get a punishment, et cetera. Like that'd be like playing a game of chess, for example, versus a kind of what some call a cruel learning environment, which is one where reinforcement is, rare, it doesn't come frequently, can be highly misleading, can lead to the wrong inference, right? You could go down, the right answer might require you to take 100 steps that appear wrong before you get to the right outcome. And that's a very difficult learning environment. So people are good in that environment, right? Because they have lots of ability to kind of learn from small data, right? From the broad panoply of experience, a little bit of information, they can often make big intellectual leaps. So we just don't know. I don't know, and I think computer scientists don't know, what will be feasible over the next decade, and whether we'll kind of hit the flat of the curve with like sort of, kind of annoyingly dense, voice activated devices that never really do what you want them to do, or whether, we'll have machines that are, developing, what we would call new ideas and designing products and developing insights and, things that we think are exclusive domain at this point.
So we basically, even the experts don't know what happens when quantum computing processing power will hit self-learning algorithms.
I think many of them think that, that will help, right? That a lot of the progress, of AI over the last couple of decades has really come from a set of tools that were around decades earlier, but were thought to be not very effective. And it turned out they were actually pretty good. It's just that we didn't have the processing power to make them usable. And now with the processing power and storage available, those tools appear to be pretty good. They're kind of brute force, but they work well enough if you can run the algorithm fast enough. You have enough storage, enough CPU cycles. So quantum computing would certainly accelerate that, but it's still a question of whether that doesn't mean you can pedal your bicycle as fast as you want. It's not going to fly, right? So it's not clear that this thing will fly once we can, hit it with, quantum pedals.
Right.
There may be other things that are required.
Well, interestingly, when we just finish on the policy questions, one of the central factors is that we've been working on here to an extent is the idea of work has been under pressure now for the best part of 30 years. First was the globalization debate, work, how much will be outsourced, how much wage pressure do we import, basically. Then there's the digitalization debate. So work has been seen as very much on the defensive. But, the one bit that pretty much all experts seem to agree on is that the work of the future, the human work of the future, is much less reliant on routine tasks and much more reliant on problem-solving skills, social skills, and creative skills. These happen to be transformative powers. So if you design the work of the future in a way that you maximize this transformative potential, you might be able to actually put this to good use to solve some of the biggest social and environmental problems. So, labor could be actually turned into a very effective policy tool itself. So that seems to be a different kind of policy framework. Would you agree with that kind of typization? Or
yeah, I think the potential is enormous. I think that the challenges are distributional ones. They're not ones of potential. It's not, these technologies, first of all, they don't work for themselves. They work for us. They're not going to get rich without us. We get rich based on them. and we can use them in all kinds of ways, right? We could use them to give ourselves more leisure. We could use them to fight more effective wars. I'm not saying we should, right? We could use them to reduce our carbon footprint, or we could use them to consume ever bigger machines that increase our carbon footprint. And so these are kind of social and political choices, and that's where the challenges lie. So we're getting lots of GDP, but it's the recipients of it are highly concentrated. Global warming is not a technological problem any longer. It's an economic problem, right? It's not that we don't know what we could do about it or couldn't possibly do it. It's a political and incentive problem to organize around, solving this huge tragedy of the commons. So I don't think there's anything intrinsically problematic about these technologies. But they challenge us to, they challenge our existing systems and require us to, create institutions that allow us to harness the benefits and minimize the harms. And it's not so clear that we're really up for that.
Yeah.
And in many cases, the institutions appear to be eroding even faster than the technologies are, improving.
Yeah, and obviously the distributional aspect that you mentioned, it also depended on ownership, isn't it? I mean, if
the thing is that a lot of our income distribution comes from ownership of labor, right? Everybody, you're born with hopefully a functioning mind and body. You go to school for some years, you learn some skills, then you sell those to the market for 35 years, and then you have enough income to retire, or savings to retire, and that's a good deal. The issue is that the labor of some is becoming incredibly scarce, and they make fabulous livings and so on. But there's another good chunk of people whose labor is in some sense become less scarce, even though there are fewer of them, because they have many more machine substitutes. And so the kind of security that comes from ownership of labor arguably is declining for those individuals. And if it's all capital income or ownership of capital or ownership of IP, well, that's very much more concentrated than ownership of labor, and especially in an era where we do not allow slavery. So that is, I think, the challenge that we face. And really, we tend to have this conceit among the highly educated, our work has been so transformed by the tools we use. Look at my smartphone, look at my big screen, right, et cetera, look at my color printer. But in fact, really our work, the tools that we use have changed. Like I don't, write on paper and pencil anymore. I use computer, I use spreadsheet. I don't invert matrices by hand. I use a statistical package and so on. But fundamentally, the work that I do or someone like me would have done 40 years ago really isn't that different. However, for people who are lower levels of education, it's not that the tools have changed, it's that the tools have displaced them from the type of work they did. They're not actually doing manufacturing work. They're not actually doing, typing and filing and sorting, calculating, phone answering in offices, right? They're doing a completely different type of work. They're doing in-person services. And so their work has really been transformed, but not necessarily for the better. And so that is, I think, that kind of bifurcation of opportunity creates real political and social and economic challenges that we're grappling with more or less successfully.
And the final question: if you look at all the sort of issues we touched upon, from the distributional questions, from the questions of problems of the planet, from impact on labor markets, from new technologies that might or might not come online anytime soon. If you were a policymaker and should create a sort of framework that is capable of preparing society for these changes, where would you start? What would be your top 3 priorities as a policymaker?
Sure. Well, I would always start with education, right? The giving people the skills to be flexible, creative, analytical, and broad. That's has just become more and more important over time, and those are the people who have those skills are doing well. So that's always, we should be investing there. Second, I think we should be taking the edge off the kind of extremes of the market through appropriate taxation and appropriate public investment, right? It's not just a matter of taking money away from people. It's about, creating opportunity such that people don't feel like they can't thrive in this system, or their children are screwed because they weren't successful, and so they'll never have a chance, right? So I think that's a matter of public investment, not just in education, but all kinds of things that give people access to good schools, as I said, but also healthcare, safety, and opportunity. And then the third lever, what the third lever is. I feel certainly in the United States, we are dramatically under investing publicly in the kind of science and R&D and technology that actually was so critical to the U.S. productivity growth in the post-war period. And productivity growth itself solves lots and lots of problems. Like when productivity is rising, that creates new tax revenue, right? It lifts a lot of boats. It creates all kinds of possibility, because when the economic growth is rapid, you can do lots of things, right? Look at what China is doing, right? Their ability to make these just incredible investments in cities, in industries, in high-speed rail, and so on, comes from year-on-year growth rates of 7-8%, right? That type of productivity growth comes in part from investment in science and R&D and education, and then public investment in those things and distributing them. So I think in the United States in particular, our kind of paralysis and fear, and our combined with our multi-decade demonization of government as government can only do harm, get it out of the way, has prevented us from making the type of forward-looking investments that would create shared prosperity and would help to solve some of these problems through rising national incomes.
And do you think these distributional questions can be solved by taxation only, or should there be also some sort of element of democratizing of capital ownership?
I don't think it should be taxation only. I think there should be, in the U.S. we have an extreme kind of shareholder stakeholder model, right, where the only legitimate stakeholders in a public corporation are shareholders in the way that the problem is framed here. And I think that is a mistake relative to in Germany, where there's a view that of multiple stakeholders, where workers are also stakeholders and there's a public stake. And I think that drives us to extreme set of choices that dramatically favor investment in capital over labor, that views workers as disposable, and firms not having a responsibility for the fates of their workforces and so on. And so even that kind of reorientation of that model could have important distributional benefits, important benefits in the sort of whether we're all we compare the U.S. to Germany, to Switzerland, to France, to Italy, to Portugal. We're all different variants on a spectrum of market economies, from kind of cowboy capitalists in the United States to kind of cuddly capitalists in Norway and Scandinavia. But it's not. These are all market economies, and so the question of how you want to shade them, in which direction, how much public investment, how much redistribution, how much who are the appropriate stakeholders, that has a big impact on the way inequality and opportunity evolves, and the degree to which people feel alienated from the opportunities that are emerging versus likely beneficiaries of them. And I think that contributes, I'm speculating, to political satisfaction or dissatisfaction, in the sense of whether we need to tear the system up and throw it away, or improve it further. So political economy matters hugely. Okay, David, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to me today. It was great. And Henning. Yeah, thank you very much. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you very much for having me on. Bye.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.